Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion, any questions that people have around virtual media or media production. Second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. Today, we'll be talking about trends. In fact, a lot of this week is talking about trends. So today, we're going to be talking about trends in audio and what we think is coming over the next year. Tomorrow, we have some special guests from Liminal and Zoom. As you may have heard, that Liminal is now part of Zoom, and so we'll have some very important folks coming on to join us tomorrow at 8 o'clock for the second hour. It should be really great. And then on Thursday, we have we're going to talk about Office Hours 2.0 and where we are now, where we're going with it, and kind of talk through some of that. Friday, of course, trends in media in general, just where do we see all of this going between AR and video and audio and all those things. And then, of course, on Saturday, we have the education hour. So we'll be that is not sent to YouTube, but you have to be in Zoom for that. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Bill, what do we have?
Oh, thank you, Alex. The first one comes from Germany, and in this case, Fred Eric Eckert in Bad Herrenalb, Germany. And he says, how would you use the Zoom platform in the near future? With the increasing quality of video, the evolving ease of use, and new functionalities, will people use Zoom instead of the usual RTMP streams like YouTube and Vimeo?
Go ahead, John.
This is true for a lot of our shows in the last year have primarily stayed all within Zoom, and no stream has gone out to RTMP.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, like John said, I work a lot with John and then our own shows, and we almost exclusively use Zoom because of everybody knows how to use it, and it's a really good platform. I mean, we use it here every day, and with the new tools, it's becoming quite the production element.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So if going to YouTube or anything like that, a lot of people are finding that doing that single person talking head thing is just not working. Well, it works in some cases, but in other cases they want to bring other people in. That's why you have StreamYard and Restream building up their studios with fourplex, and that's why I've been doing the Zoom ISO stuff and after hours to figure out how I'm going to, in 2022, I'm going to do a new show, tech related, where we're going to have people come in and we're going to have some fun with it.
Obviously, we're planning to do a lot more in Zoom. So we've been doing this for quite some time. And if you look at especially the 2.0 stream in HDR, you're going to see something that I think looks very, very competitive. It's still, it has its issues, and we're still working through some of those, but it's getting to be a great looking picture, and it sounds good and looks good. The one thing that is different between when people talk about Zoom and RTMP is, and even HLS, is the ability to cache. So Zoom is a real-time solution, and that makes it a little bit more sensitive to fluctuations in bandwidth. So I don't know if it's going to replace what we have there, but I think it definitely, for a lot of shows, I think it's going to be the core. Next question.
Eddie Scott comes up next from Mission Viejo, California, and he says, what's the best matching display to pair with an M1 iMac?
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, you didn't say price constraint, so I'm going to say the $6,000 XDR display. Yeah, we'll leave it to that.
I think the LGs are probably the best color that I've seen as far, there's a variety. There's the 4-up, there's the single ones, a 4K, display capable of Dolby Vision is what I would probably look for in those areas. And I think LG is doing the best job in that area. I have to admit that mostly what I get are Dells because they're cheaper. So for what I'm doing, it depends on whether you need that specific monitor to have the color accuracy that you need. I have a Dell here that was a lot less expensive. I use a Spider 5 to get it to a color that is reasonably good. And literally for a lot of these ones, it's only 1080 because I just needed to do, it's just managing something. But as soon as if I was going to work on it 100% of the time, I'd probably look for 4K and good HDR, a color representation. Next question. Sorry.
Same
See what happens in Tuesday. I'm not used to being on. See, now I'm not used to being host. I came out of Tuesday. All right, no, there's some inside baseball. Okay, next question.
Nah, yeah, fine. Eddie Scott in Mission Viejo is up next. He says, considering a wireless hotspot, is there any resource other than buying all of them to find out which might offer the best service locally?
Go, Rupert.
hopefully you wouldn't need to buy all of them, but really the performance is going to depend on some things external to the hotspot itself, like the coverage really in your area you're going to be using it, and really how the network is going to perform under load. If you're doing it for an event, how that's going to perform when you've got crowds of people. In terms of what one maybe to select, I would try and narrow it down to a hotspot that will accept external antennas, particularly for the cell side, and that will ideally provide you with a wired connection to your computer or your network, either over USB, but even better, a Ethernet connection. Avoid anything that's locked to a certain carrier. That means you can swap out SIMs to get better coverage. I've had quite good luck with the Netgear ones on the simpler side, and then of course there's Peplink if you want to go further up the chain.
Go, Jason.
Well, I would say just get something that's unlocked and, ask your neighbors, ask your friends. It really depends very heavily on what it's going to be needed for. The variance between the very worst and the very best is going to be huge, but, probably the top two, not so much.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, and what you need to determine is basically coverage, not necessarily the hotspot. You can get a hotspot that'll work with any SIM. There's a website called cellularcoverage.com, and it compares the maps of the different. You click on each one of these here, and it'll show you the coverage map for each one, and it actually details the coverage of each carrier and compares them to each other. So that's a good spot to go to if you need to compare the coverage in your specific area of each of the individual carriers in the United States.
Yeah, the challenge is
you can look for a similar thing.
Yeah, the challenge is really that it may tacitly have coverage, but it doesn't have a lot of capacity. So Las Vegas is a perfect example of that, where you have a lot of coverage across Las Vegas, but very little capacity. And so you end up kind of with very little bandwidth. You can connect to all bars, but no service. So I think that's the thing you have to kind of take into account, and that's what you have to kind of test by hand. Now, I have a couple of different phones and with different services, and so I take them to places and figure that out. But that is the hard part. If you can collect a couple friends that know, to that kind of point where Jason, rather than just asking them, all go somewhere and just walk around and see who's getting what. Doing speed tests with speedtest.net is a great way to know beyond how many bars it has and whether it has coverage. What is the throughput that you're actually getting? If you're going to sign into a long contract, I would do that a couple different times of the day if you're going to use that service to figure out which one you want to use. When in doubt and you don't know what it's going to be, the best one nationwide is Verizon. I can just tell you as someone who does this, if you don't know, and now there are places that T-Mobile is better and there's places that AT&T is better, but if you don't know, Verizon has the best coverage because of the approach that it takes to its wireless. Next question.
Our next question comes from TJ Asher, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And he says, since Office Hours is a 501c3 corporation, are monetary donations tax deductible?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jason.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no, but do it anyway.
They should be. We're doing the research right now to make sure that we have the proper documentation and everything else, and we should know by Thursday. Obviously, we've had a couple requests in the back end to know whether we're going to have it before the end of the year. Some people want to move things around, and so we're trying to get that. Since we just got it, we're trying to get the accounts up and get all the other bits and pieces. But we'll let you know before the end of the year. Next question.
Moving on. Up next is Rick Coombs of Columbia, Tennessee. And he says, looking for a wireless gooseneck mic to put on the podium. Only ones I have found must have phantom power, but there is no power where this mic must be located. Any suggestions? And he notes also cannot use a lapel or headset mic.
Go ahead, David.
So this isn't...
Hello.
Sorry, this isn't technically a gooseneck, but I'm a big fan of the Rode Go 2, which you can get one of the Rode Interview guys. It clips right on here, throw a windscreen on top of that, and then you could put this in a gooseneck mic holder, and it would work just great.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So if you get the XLRs, I got the Sony right here. I'm pretty sure the Sennheiser has the same thing. There are phantom power options on here. And the cool thing about this one is it is USB recharge. So you can actually put in a micro USB cable in here and then plug that in, and it'll always stay on. You can put batteries in here. So if they do need to unplug it and move it around, you can do that. But this one works really well.
Good, Craig.
I was going to go with the DPA 4099. It's actually listed as an instrument mic. It is a small gooseneck. It terminates to a microdot, which you can get an adapter that goes to most wireless body packs, as well as to an XLR, so it gives you that functionality.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, a lot of people just use wireless handheld mics like this Shure wireless stick mic, and they put it on a gooseneck, and that gives you the ability to actually remove it from the gooseneck and use it as a handheld and walk around and interview people with it, and then put it back in the gooseneck. It's all self-contained. It doesn't require phantom power. The transmitter is contained in the bottom of the microphone itself, and there's a number of different manufacturers that make these wireless handhelds.
Yeah. For mission critical stuff, the one place we don't use wireless is in the podium, and that's because that's our safety valve. If all else fails with wireless, we want to make sure that they can walk somewhere and just start talking. So we stick with wired there. An SM58 is a dynamic mic, and it will work for that. It's the same, I think the same capsule as what Courtney just showed you. It just has a wire in the back. So that's another way to do it. And oftentimes, for most mission critical stuff, we have two of them, and they go two different directions around the room to make sure that they don't get cut. Next question.
It involves project and team management tools, and George Butters of Halifax, Nova Scotia wonders if anyone's using Clickup, Monday, or Trello to keep projects out of the swamp known as email.
I don't use them. We've talked about it. Yeah, go David.
I was just going to say, I signed up for Monday the other day, the free trial. I tried to use it, but I live in email and calendar. So,
yeah, go ahead, Sky.
Yeah, each of these systems have their own unique history because they were organizational tools within an organization or a company and each of them have a culture. And so consequently, to get your people to buy into it is, like I say, 80% of the challenge is the training. So consequently, I use Slack, and we're still figuring it out. Discord is another, again, the free method that I'm understanding how we collect ideas. But getting people off of email is tricky, but it's to have one place that everybody talks to is very helpful. But it's a mind thing for your people.
Go ahead, Jason.
I've had good luck with very narrow constraint projects like, development tasks with Trello. Monday to me feels like a very big, very pretty pivot table. So, nah.
Yeah, the what we moved to at Pixel Core for a long time was Slack, and it got rid of 90% of our email. Like it was just because it was funny when it started, it was hard to get into, but at some point, if you sent me an email that was shorter than 5 or 6 lines, I'd be like, why is this not in Slack? Like why are you making me go back out to email? And I don't think I ever really recovered. Like once we went down that path, the idea of using email for all my communication is really the only time I use email is to talk to external folks, and then I mostly use Discord at this point for what we do. Next question.
About on the same topic, Aaron Husledge of Durham, North Carolina says, how would people feel about using a project management system to manage office hours projects? He uses Jira and Trello a lot in his job and has found them useful.
Go ahead, Rupert.
Yeah, I do see the Jira Trello combination used quite a lot in the wild. Jira for the ticketing and the work tracking and even time accounting, and then Trello as maybe like a side app for notice boarding and stuff like that. Although Jira has a Kanban board, I think that they have as an alternative to something like Trello. Jira is an Atlassian product, and I like Atlassian a lot. I've had very good support at an enterprise level from Atlassian, and they are taking a very healthy approach to remote work. So if we were going to select a platform, I think that would be a healthy relationship.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I would second the motion on Jira. I even use it just for myself to keep myself organized, and in the event that my projects grow in size, it's easy to bring somebody up to speed by just adding them to the project. So yeah, love it.
I'm 100% behind experiment with anything. Like that's what we use these events, these projects for. I don't care if 3 different projects use 3 different ones. We'll just learn which ones we like and which ones we don't. But I think that it sounds like Jira is one that we should try to implement. So let's if there's something that you need from me to do that, then contact me in Discord. Next question.
Our next question comes from Westchester, New York, where Dan Goldstein wonders, is it okay to plug a surge-protected power strip into a UPS as long as you don't exceed that max load of the UPS?
Go ahead, Rupert.
So anytime you introduce additional connections, you've got a risk factor there of things getting loose, and that's really your biggest factor there. Is the power load is the capacity is one thing, but the moment you get a loose connection in one of those joints, then that could be your weakest link in the chain. Other than that, I mean, having a surge protected specifically is maybe a bit superfluous because your UPS will likely be doing the surge protection part. But if it's a power strip for the sake of getting more outlets, then that is fine, providing you keep everything secure and tight and safe.
Go ahead, Courtney.
I would say it's kind of a bad idea because most surge-protected power strips have what's called an MOV, a metal oxide varistor inside of them. That's how they handle the surge. They detect it. It puts a resistance across the line to attenuate spikes in the power. And those exist in the UPS as well. And so when you plug one with a varistor in it to the UPS, then you've got 2 of those varistors across the line, and they will kind of compete with each other, and so it could cause a little more problems. If you want to extend the outlets, just use a power strip that doesn't have a surge protection built into it, and you should be fine if you're plugging it into a UPS.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Most fire codes say you cannot put a surge protector into a surge protector. It's a hazard.
I'll go with Jason.
Very little to add here, so I'll just yield the time.
Next question.
We are moving on to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Tobias Moss there says, a director of a nonprofit asks you, what do I need to know about all this stuff in 2022? What would you focus on if you had 6 hours with them? And what if you just had 1 hour?
Go ahead, David.
Empower your staff and your lay leadership with the funding, with the time, with the encouragement to keep learning, because this is always changing and ever growing. The rest is commentary. Go and learn.
Go ahead, John.
I want to make sure they know that it's not 2019 anymore, that the world has changed. Communication is important to their organization, and they need to look at the tools that are there to build the community that we can do through these new communication tools. And as a professor, I could stretch 1 hour into 6 real easy.
Yeah. I would say that community is the next thing. It's community is king, and community is about to take the throne. Like, you have to figure out how you're going to build a community, and the engine for communities is discussion. It's It's having communication with between the members, and so you got to figure that out. It's not one to many; it's many to many, or many to a few. But what we're doing here is, I think, that the beginning of something unique. But I think that it's going to be figuring out how to build true communities online is going to start in 2022. It started with us, I think, in a lot of ways, but it's going to keep on growing over the next decade. Next question.
Next one this morning comes from Liberty White, and Liberty says, oh no, wait, that something misfired.
Don't.
Yeah, sorry. I can't see it on my screen. So, Alex, do you have access to the question?
Do you see it now?
There we go. It's 3/4 of my screen, and it's cut off. Okay. So sorry about that, but something has gone.
Just keep reading.
Okay.
You want me to read it?
Yeah. Could you, Jeffrey? Because I can't even actually see the ends of the lines.
Yeah. Liberty White from Atlanta, Georgia goes, we're doing a LinkedIn Live series to teach children how to draw. What's the best way to bring in another guest? We're using StreamYard, but I'd like to hear a link or hear your alternatives, and there's a link.
I think StreamYard, for bringing a guest in specifically for LinkedIn Live, may be your best bet. It's already got the streaming directly to it. I think that if Zoom added that feature, I think that would be a good thing. Now, what you could do is also use Zoom and then pass it through. I believe Jeffrey can correct me, but I believe Restream will handle LinkedIn Live as well. So you could bring someone in over Zoom, do a custom RTMP out of Zoom into into Restream and then push it to LinkedIn. So
That would
it's just-
absolutely work.
yeah, yeah. So I think that would be the way to do it, and I think you'll have a better experience with Zoom than StreamYard. Next question.
All right. Tim McCullough is up next. The show is 2.0 the show, an end product in its own right, or proof of concept? Either way, what follows, he wonders.
Yeah, the 2.0 show is both an end product and a proof of concept. I mean, we're proving that we can do a different kind of show than anybody's seen before. We're playing a bit harder than I've seen other people play. I mean, no one's tried to get 20 people into a discussion every day and have it broadcasted out at 4K HDR and have a great discussion and have it be smooth and integrated and actually full of good content. That's a very unique show. So I would call that a proof of concept because I've never seen it before. The goal, though, as an end product is to, open it up a lot wider to a lot of people. That doesn't mean that we'll necessarily change a lot of our back end, of the under the water part of the iceberg, which is after hours and a lot of the other things that we do, Discord and so on and so forth. Those will probably actually, as we turn there's kind of a yin and yang between office hours and after hours. As we turn office hours up, after hours will be harder to get into, and so will Discord. It's not. There'll still be people coming in, but it will be more exclusive, not less exclusive, because office hours will get wider and wider. We're going to first put it across multiple social platforms, and then into broadcast. So so we're kind of growing towards that piece. I think that the opportunity for us to make it a wider show is that number one is that we can, as a show. We can push the industry in a direction that makes the most sense for the most people. I think that a lot of times we end up with the industry being pushed by a bunch of decisions that are not really based on actual use. So we can actually have a pretty big say in the direction that things are going if we get a wider audience. I mean, it's one we've already made a pretty big difference for a lot of companies at the size that we're at. If we get to a point where there's 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 people watching every morning, we'll have a different level of leverage, and so we can kind of help push that. For us, what that means is that, we become the place that everyone wants to announce their products, and so we can get to a point at some point where we could bring anybody in for a second hour, because we have that kind of coverage, and that gives us industry access. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to kind of both improve what we get from a content perspective, as well as being able to kind of move the industry forward. I mean, I think that a lot of times people aren't doing a lot of the things that we talk about all the time because they don't know better, and so what we can do is expand that market so that more and more and more people know how to use Zoom at a higher level, that it's not Zoom fatigue, it's bad audio and video. And so if we could say that in front of 100,000 people a day instead of 100 people a day, or 200 people a day or whatever, be useful. So I think, because it's not just those, that creates a conversation among everyone. So we can kind of help build a bigger context for what is a potential or a possible future. So I think that's why we want to get in front of more people and make it more broadcast-like, is because it allows us to, educate at a different level. The other thing is, as a proof of concept, is this is one subject. There's many, many subjects that could be done in the model that we're doing. So if you look at the Office Hours 2.0, which we're putting up on GitHub, if I don't want to have an exclusive control over that. I want everyone to keep on evolving that. If you look at how we're integrating that with what we're doing here and with Zoom, the goal is that this could be about cars or about space or about cooking or about gardening or about birds or about music. All these things there could be a similar version of this for many, many things. We're figuring out how to make that actually work, and then we will continue to subdivide. And most likely, my thought is that everyone here, some people here, will be the seeds to those new things. They'll go, I like this, but I'm interested in this, and they'll start building a new version of that, based on what we've done here. That's the goal. Next question.
It comes to us from Douglas Carmichael, and Douglas Carmichael says, what have your experiences been with Unity Connect? I've tested Audiomovers and was impressed with its uncompressed audio transport, but are there any advantages to Unity Connect?
Go ahead, Sky.
Well, I've used it as a civilian, and it's the low barrier to entry. It's available on
And
a
are you
mobile
talking about Unity
device?
Comms or Unity Connect?
I
There's two different
apologize.
things.
Thank you. Please define.
Yeah. So go, Jim.
Yeah, so we've used it quite a bit with Todd Reynolds' shows, and it's ease of use to Sky's point, but specifically to Unity Connect is tremendous. You can get multi-channel audio between 2 points in seconds.
And is that
the
uncompressed
sound
audio?
qualities. That I believe is, I don't know. I don't know if it's compressed or uncompressed.
I think it's possible. I don't know if it's the standard setting, for it. So yeah, but for as far as transport goes, there's also, I believe, Source Connect is the other one. So those are the big three. So there's Audiomovers, Source Connect, and Unity Connect. Source Connect and Unity Connect are really designed as real time. I think Audiomovers may not be quite the same as far as the latency or what it's designed for, but I'm not 100% certain. Next question.
HDR is one of the subjects here. Marty Adius in Maryland says, is HDR video only viewable on an HDR monitor? The Office Hours 2.0 feed in today's gallery now looks awfully dull.
Yeah, so that's a different curve that's being applied to, that is the HDR curve. So what happens, instead of being linear and going straight to white, it basically has this curve over, which makes it creates, what you're actually seeing is it creating more space for more detail in the lights and the darks that are going out right now. This is not going to be the feed that goes out as the SDR feed when we do this. We'll either figure out a way to correct that back, but most likely what we're going to do is, at least in the first 2.1, we will run the whole show in SDR and then bump it to HDR, and that will allow us to have an SDR feed that's raw that goes out that will still look normal. There'll be some version of this in the future that we are doing everything in HDR, and then we'll convert back down to SDR. We're waiting for some features that YouTube is going to most likely add that'll allow us to make that conversion more seamless. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, and if you were to look at it just to illustrate, this is me and the YouTube feed next to the HDR feed, and I grabbed this just before a show start just to show you sort of what happens. One thing I think, though, I do have an HDR television. It's a Dolby stereo enabled device, and I am seeing it too. It's okay, not great. So I think, Alex, is it fair to say that the tuning of this is something that you're going to best be able to view on an iDevice of the last 2 years?
The iDevices are accurate. So if it's not showing up well on an iDevice, then it's not showing up on your TV, but it is showing up well on an iDevice, then it's your TV settings. So just to say, I'm syncing it completely to iOS devices because they're the only screens I really trust, and then I force my TVs to look like my iOS devices because Apple spends billions of dollars on those displays, more than the TV manufacturers. So the TV manufacturers have tons and tons of settings, and my iOS devices don't. They just do. I'm just going to do this thing. So now the other thing that may be occurring is that we're sending HDR10 feed out, and your TV may not be interpreting the HDR10 very well. So or YouTube may not be. We're still working on that. So it could be a flat HDR10 response of not having the metadata. So it's not taking full advantage of it yet. And again, the reason that we're doing HDR to YouTube is to figure out what's working and not working across the entire pipeline. I fully expect, we're just doing it because I don't want to spend more money on AWS right now. So we're doing it all in HDR just because I'm just sending one stream out. Starting later this week, we'll be sending it out to SDR and HDR, and then we'll be looking at both of them. The primary feed that we'll promote is actually going, after all this HDR work, the primary feed that we promote is going to be the SDR feed, because we assume that most people won't, but there'll be a button like, hey, do you want to watch the HDR feed? And then people will be able to decide. So that's how that's going to work. But yeah, I would argue that if you're having trouble with the TV, though, it's probably either misunderstanding the HDR10 tag, or it's not set correctly, which most TVs are not set correctly. That's the
impression I get. It's like, just Dolby stereo, just buying a TV set to view office hours content.
That's the first step. But then now you have to look at, like the cinema one will look really drab. There's kind of a standard or everything. There's kind of an everything off setting on most of the TVs, and that's usually where I try to get to, is turning all of the TV functions off. It's funny that the manufacturers have spent so much time putting so many features into the TVs, and most people who really care about the TV just want to turn all the features off and just have it do nothing, other than play a video. And so that's the hard part with all of these TVs, is to get the TV functionality out of the way is the part that you have to figure out how to do. Next question.
The next question comes from Mitchell Hill in Wilmington, Delaware. And Mitchell says, I have a small on-air neon sign in my background. What could I use to knock the video level down a stop?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Be careful about using a dimmer. Most neon signs do not like to have a dimmer on the front end because they have a high voltage step-up transformer. The other thing is be careful about that, because if it is a real neon sign, that high voltage can generate noise in any wireless system, so that could be an additional problem. But to knock down the brightness of it, you can use filters, ND filter gel, ND filter gels. And remember the number of the filter gel, divide that number by 3, and that's the number of stops that it knocks down the brightness. So ND3 is 1 stop, ND6 is 2 stops, etc.
Go ahead, TJ.
Courtney answered it.
Mitchell?
Yeah, I just got it, and if I turn it off, it's probably a little easier to see what it's made of. It's just a plexiglass box with an open front, and it's a small neon tube with a very small, very quiet transformer. I checked both of those things.
Go ahead, Bill.
+1 on the ND gel. Plus, you can get ND with some other filtering. They have ND with CTO and things like that, so that might knock even more down off of the light. I'd try them both and see what works best.
I think they actually make ND plexiglass as well, so you could theoretically put a plexiglass front on that has the ND built into it, and then that'll definitely bring it down. Of course, you might want to experiment with the gels to figure out which one you want to use before you spend the money on the plexi. But the plexi isn't very expensive. We've used kind of smoked plexi that cost us, that would cost us like $3 or something. Go ahead, Jeffrey. Did you have your hand?
Oh, that was for the next question. That's for the next question.
Oh, you're in this question. Oh, okay. Yeah, you can't move it early. All right, next question.
Done reading. What are the first principles about plugs, extension cords for audio devices?
Go ahead, Craig.
First one is good grounding always, and don't cheap out on lightweight cables or cheap connectors.
Go ahead, Sky.
Always have more than you think you need, because there's always that one last 3 inches of something that you have to connect from this to that. And I also use Home Depot toolkit and keep them so that can be separated. You can find them.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Try not to cross as much as possible and use as little as possible, because that's where you run into problems. And understand your audio equipment, know the chips inside, because if you start mix and matching, it might have one chip in one and another chip in another, and they might not work that well.
Good, Courtney.
If you're going to be using these for mics that are going to be handheld but wired, or on a mic stand, I would use a ground fault interrupter based micro extension. What do you call it? A GFI built into that line. So if there's a short, because frequently in music, somebody's guitar could be improperly grounded and carry an electrical voltage through the microphone when they grab it. That's happened many times. So if you have a GFI on there, ground fault interrupter, it'll detect that and cut the power.
Yeah, and you can get, when you're connecting two things together, they have these little latches that you can put on that will keep them from coming apart. Now, when I worked in a farm, we used to circle them around and then tie them in and pull them. It's not good for the cable. So we did it on the farm, but I wouldn't do it in production. So you can put them together, and then a lot of times, a lot of us will tape them to make sure that they don't just get pulled apart. But you can also get these little latches that will latch onto the cables and just keep them from moving. And those are relatively useful as far as if you're going to attach two extensions. Next question.
Next question comes from George Butters in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And George says, if you use a project management portal, do you include client training and the additional software licensing costs in your project billing?
I don't. I mean, that's a service that's a value add that I add to what we're doing. So if we're doing something for the client, I'm not going to charge them for how I manage the project. That's my 2 cents. We don't have anyone else raising their hands. So next question.
Next one is about troubleshooting, and Tobias Moss in Minneapolis says, a brief buzz or surge noise occasionally gets recorded through my Flow 8 across all inputs. How would you troubleshoot that?
Go ahead, Rupert.
Occasionally, I'd be interested to know a bit more about that, whether it's a sort of predictable frequency or it's completely random, and actually for how long it happens. But probably some kind of electrical noise creeping in through the power supply or down one of your grounds from something maybe nearby switching on or off, something like that. So a good old-fashioned process of elimination, probably try and disconnect as much as you can and then build it up over time. Try and get the mixer on a standalone power supply, see if that makes a difference. Maybe run it off battery pack, just try and isolate things one by one. I've seen sometimes intermittent problems like that with either something nearby kicking on and off like an air conditioner or something like that, or standby nearby trickle charges. So just try and isolate those things one by one.
I'll go, Jeffrey.
Yeah, get the Flow 8 on a different circuit, see what happens, and then take everything off and then start from the beginning and then see where you have the problem, and that's where you make the decisions at that point.
Good, Courtney.
It's difficult to describe, but a lot of digital equipment that uses digital signal processing, of course, has a microprocessor in there that's controlling all that stuff. And during boot up, our state changing within that processor, a lot of times you'll sometimes hear the noise of the processor clock sneak into the audio if they're doing something before they have set all the audio levels. So if that's the intermittent noise you're hearing, it'll sound not random, but it'll be changing in a specific pattern, and that's how you can detect if it's processor noise or just general buzz.
Chris?
Yeah, I've got a unique situation in my apartment, and I've talked about it before a long time ago. There's a weird high-pitched whining sound that happens in this apartment, and it was happening last night when I was setting up for this morning. Whether or not my mic cable was up or down would make a difference. But it does, wireless actually works better for me sometimes. And my point is that I can't find it, and it's always around somewhere. And it has nothing to do with whether I'm plugged into mains power or I'm battery powered, or I have wireless or not wireless or whatever. And I can't find it. And every once in a while, I know it's unique maybe to New York City and a 100-year-old building or whatever, but it might be something like that at the end of the day. It's just like ever looming.
I have places in my office, for whatever reason, if my mic is at a very specific angle, it'll pick up a hum. Like if I just turn it another 45 degrees, it does not. And it worries me that how that's affecting me if my mic is picking it up at a certain angle, but I just keep moving. All right, next question.
This is in the world of Amazon Web Services. Guy Cochran in Seattle, Washington asks, what software could be used in AWS to convert Zoom feeds to HDR?
None that I know of. So that is the problem, is mapping this to it. Now, theoretically, if everybody delivered their Zoom feeds looking like what you're seeing in 2.0, which is that if they delivered it with the HDR curve, either HLG, so you could theoretically run it in HLG and then pass it through the system. So you could have an HLG feed and everybody delivering to you was HLG. You could theoretically in Media Live just say, pass through the video and it would show up as HDR. We have not been successful at that. We think that Media Live may not be tagging correctly as it goes to YouTube. So we're working on that in the back end. So right now I don't know of any. And the real problem is that it's not really just going 709 to HDR10 or 709 to HLG. I'm making a bunch of color adjustments in the back end based on, so I have an FSHDR, and for the stream, I'm pushing a variety of things around. So it's not a true 709 to HDR10. What we really want is for Amazon to add something that lets us apply a LUT. So a lookup table that will convert from one thing to the other. That way we could make the adjustments that we want over time and then be able to run an SDR and then punch it to whatever format we need. But the LUT is not available. Not that I haven't been asking for 3 years. Not that I'm bitter. Next question.
Out to the U.S. East Coast again for Ed Judge in West Granby, Connecticut. And he says, I'm going to be conducting some online classes via Zoom, planning on using a Nikon Z7 for the camera and an AKG C414 going into a UAD Apollo Twin and then into the computer. Any thoughts or advice would be appreciated.
I go ahead, Rupert.
Sounds like you're off to a good start. I think some of the basics will you want to take into account. First of all, Ethernet, get off Wi-Fi, for example, and then it sounds like you're already working on your audio and your camera, and that's good. Then it'll depend a little bit on what kind of classes you're running, whether it's one-to-one, one-to-many, but generally speaking, the other participants, the same thing will apply to them. Try and get them off Wi-Fi. Try and get them with, headphones. Try and get them with the best audio and framing that you can. All those kind of good Zoom best practice things. It sounds like you're taking care of over your video image, or at least that's important to you. So you may want to be on a HD Zoom account. And if the audio is important to you, then you'll be wanting to use original sound and stereo audio and things like that.
Good, Roscoe.
Since that's a still camera primarily, you want to make sure the power saving is set to infinity, or you're killing the power saving mode on that camera. I put a YouTube clip into Mukana that you can look at. I'll show you how to set that up. And then that Apollo Twin is a Thunderbolt, so I'm assuming you're going into a Mac, maybe not. But if it is, you might want to look at something like Audio Hijack to make sure you can sync up your audio, those kind of things.
Mitchell?
Yeah, a lot of different ideas for doing it. In my particular case, I agree with your choice on the AKG 414. It serves me very well. And I would also go with an ATEM. A mini would be fine to get started. And the only other thing that I would do, since you did mention specifically on price, is go with a Sound Devices Mix Pre 3, or if you can get one, or 6. And go through the camera audio, because that means that you're going to maintain sync, and you won't have to be worrying about offsets. That's what I was trying to say. On the audio sync, you're going to be totally in sync the whole time.
Go ahead, John.
It's a good set of equipment, but the room, the lighting, and the acoustics will make a big difference. And also, that's a large diaphragm microphone. I find when I'm lecturing, I'm spending more time standing up and moving. So having a headset's a little better, so when you go off camera or off microphone, you don't lose the audio like I did there.
Next question.
Next question comes from Durham, North Carolina, and Aaron Husledge. And Aaron asks, how can I tell if HDR video is getting triggered on my MacBook Pro M1?
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, the M1. So I was going to answer it in a little bit of a different way. I thought it was a mini and not an M1. It should be HDR no matter what. And if it's not coming through on YouTube, good luck with that.
Yeah, if you're going out to an external monitor, a commercial monitor, it will tell you, hey, I'm getting vision, or I'm getting something. You'll see a little flag pop up. Folks like me can just tell whether I'm seeing HDR or not. If I know there's an HDR monitor, I can just see it. But I think that it is hard with a professional monitor to know whether it's activating, because it doesn't give you that heads up display. Next question.
Next one comes up about sports broadcast and production trucks, and Gordon Lake in Los Angeles, California wants to know, when non-sport clients need to decide between traditional production trucks with Sony cameras or fly packs with Blackmagic cameras, what are the pros and cons of each?
Go ahead, Doug.
Well, one of the reasons we built our truck was so that our setup stays more consistent. And, when you have to go in and carry all this gear in, set it up, and then do your production, there's all kinds of chances to break something. So having a truck, a lot of that equipment just stays in place, plugged in directly every single time. And so that's a benefit there. To the point of pros and cons against the cameras, whatever cameras you decide to use, stick with the same camera, because the color space of cameras is different no matter what range of prices you're in. So if you're Sony, stick with Sony. If you're Panasonic, stick with Panasonic. Blackmagic. But mixing and matching cameras can get you into a world of spending more time trying to get those cameras to match than you want to. But but I love my truck, and I won't ever not have a truck.
I go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, Doug covered most of it quite well. The difference may be the sporting type setup. You want a greater depth of field, so a lot of times they'll have 3-chip cameras with smaller sensors, which will give you a greater depth of field, so they don't have to be as accurate in following focus. Whereas the Blackmagic cameras with a single sensor give you a shallower depth of field, which is good for a non-sport situation where you want to focus only on a person. Maybe they're standing in front of a iMac screen or an LED wall, and that'll throw the LED wall out of focus more, so you'll have less problems with moire. So that's a consideration as to the type of camera that they're using. Can be better for corporate type setups than it is for sports.
We've definitely used both. Most of what we've done, of course, has been Blackmagic pipelines for corporate. We found that to be very useful. And we had a trailer that would do all Blackmagic. so it was still the truck, so to speak, of being able to roll up and roll cables out relatively easily and get set up. But we also found that you can build up fly kits that are pretty well designed that will take very little time to get set up and running through it, as long as you think about the pipeline and how they're going to interconnect between each other. So we found that we could do either one of those. There's a lot of places where fly packs aren't practical, trucks aren't practical. If you're on the 9th floor of a corporate building and there's not a lot of good egress, how do you get the cables from the 9th floor down to the broadcast truck becomes an issue. Trucks work great, though, when you're in an arena style or a theater style where you do have egress and you can move those in and out. So we've used them. The trucks we've still had trucks fail. So just so you know, it doesn't get new trucks, due to power issues and so on and so forth. I've told that horror story, I think, in the past. So it's not. It doesn't mean that they're completely, reliable. They're much more reliable because they're just set up to do the thing. They tend to be a lot more flexible. You have huge patch bays that you can repatch and rebuild. But a lot of times for corporate, you end up with a truck that is way more than they need on any given day. And so you're paying for a lot of stuff that you're not using in the truck, unless it's a really big corporate event. So the fly pack can be a little bit more customized. We built the fly packs for the events. We tear our fly packs apart, put them back together. So we would design a fly pack for a given event and then build it out bespoke for each event, oftentimes to build it just for that piece. If it was a really large event. For small events, we had, 8 or 10 kits that we would send out. I will not shoot a corporate event with a sensor smaller than Super 35 under 75 feet, period. Like, I will not put in what I consider, 2/3 inch chips. To me is cheap looking. It looks like broadcast, and so I vastly prefer under 75 feet. I think it looks way better for a corporate environment. Courtney's point is perfect for sports. It's almost impossible to shoot with a Super 35. You can watch Fox Sports struggling with that, with their full frame stuff at the end zones right now. It's very, very hard to shoot. So I think 2/3 makes sense for sports when you're throwing 200 feet. And when I go over 75 feet, I convert to 2/3 inch chips because my camera operators can't hold focus. But under 75 feet on a corporate event, I will only use Super 35 because it makes everybody look more important and special, and it makes the sets look bigger and better, and all of those things. And the most cost-effective way to go to Super 35 is a Blackmagic pipeline. Next question.
Next one's about office hours itself, and Michael Andreas of Olathe, Kansas says, when first starting with office hours, I looked for the live feed right at 7 a.m. Pacific time, but the show hadn't started due to the usual late start. For the next new people, could the YouTube stream start earlier than that with a placeholder display?
Go ahead, Rupert.
So you can kind of wait in Mukana, and then the stream will pop up there when it's live. The workflow under 2.0 might be a little different, and I won't speak to that. But in just the wider Zoom context, I'd be interested to see how this is, because the YouTube stream right now, of course, is triggered by when the event goes live in Zoom. So it's kind of dependent on that. So in a wider Zoom context, I'd be interested to see how, when they get the backstage feature in webinar, whether that will allow you to assemble your panel behind the scenes, start your YouTube stream, and then go live when you're ready.
Yeah, a lot of people really enjoy the behind the scenes, and that's, I think, why a lot of people jump into Zoom to watch us. Is so I don't know if I want to shield that away from some portion of the audience. we are going to definitely go to a countdown clock at some point. And so we will start early. Here's the challenge with starting early is that if you start early, the invites go out from YouTube to everyone at the moment that not at the moment, between 3 and 5 minutes after you send it out. Everybody that should be notified, who has signed up for notification, will be notified. And, YouTube doesn't do it instantly. It cascades over 3 to 5 minutes. Same thing with Facebook and everybody else. That's how you warm the edge. And so so it goes out slowly like that. And so in a perfect world, you start the countdown clock with it at about 3 to 5 minutes out. And the best thing to do is to have other content that people can watch before that. Someday we'll have that where there's tons of cool content that is filling up that 5 minutes with the countdown clock, and you're seeing videos and everything else, or maybe you're just seeing us talk. I don't know which. I think that we need to be, and then it'll go black right at the very top of the hour, because again, we're going to be syncing for actual terrestrial broadcast as we go to the top of the hour. So we will tighten up to starting more on time because of that, and down to the second, probably by February 1. So you'll see us start to tighten it up. There's been a lot of moving parts as I try to figure a bunch of things out and on my end. So we've been starting a little late here and there. But we'll be slowly tightening that up over January down to a black space at the top of the hour. But before that, again, we're going to have a countdown clock. I finished the first one as a test, and it took 8 hours to render. I don't know what I did. But anyway, I flipped some switch. It's been taking me a week to figure out why it's not rendering correctly. So anyway, that'll be up hopefully in the next day or two. But we will be experimenting with those countdown clocks to make that work. And but we expect us to tighten this solution and start before the top of the hour in the next short period of time. Next question.
The next question comes from Douglas Carmichael. Douglas says, would there be any way other than ZoomOSC to control the Zoom client from a disability-friendly interface? For example, start a meeting with a single switch.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, so Zoom does have the support for Stream Deck. Also within the Zoom client, there is a menu pick for hotkeys, and those can either be local hotkeys or global hotkeys, and you could link in any other type of hardware switching into that.
Go ahead, John.
And Zoom does a lot in the educational space. So in addition to those easy way of using it, there's live caption, there's keyboard shortcuts that we talked about, and you could do audio descriptions. And so I think there's lots of ways to access it. And of course, the interaction with the OS that you're working with will impact how easy it is to use the client.
I go, Rupert.
There is also a suggested keypad, shortcut keypad for Zoom. I believe it's called the Zap Pad.
I have in accessibility inside of the Mac. I have it set up so that if I turn it on, I can say join. I literally just say join after hours or join office hours, and if I'm logged in, it'll immediately take me right into the thing. So I just say the word and it does it. The reason I don't use it all the time is because for some reason in Monterey, the overhead, it's taking like 100%, like a whole core to run. I don't know what it's doing, but it's not, and it runs all the time. I couldn't figure out what was drawing so much resources out of what I was doing. And as I looked at the processes, I realized that for some reason, the voice recognition, even when not being used, is running really high. So I think there's just a bug at the moment, but you can do it as voice activation. Next question.
And the next one comes from JHB in New York. And the question is, do you think Blackmagic Design will ever expand the media tab beyond the 20 slots? Thanks.
Go ahead, Jen.
Well, firstly, you can get beyond the 20 slots if you get a larger ATEM, which I'm sure you don't want to do. But the other option is using software that uses the SDK. One example would be Tidal Live that has some direct Blackmagic integrations, and it will dynamically put files into the media pool for you, create it and drop it in. One cautionary note, though, is when you're using ATEM software control to remotely control a ATEM, when you have a whole large number of images in the pool, as you connect, all of those will get transferred to the remote location, and that can cause a bandwidth problem depending on what your upstream is.
And go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, Jim mentioned a lot of the problems is because all of those images in the media pool have to reside in local memory within the switcher itself. And it's going to be an expense for them to add more memory, although memory is getting cheaper. They might expand the memory sometime, but also the problem is that those images have to come from the outside world and load in, like he said, every time you start the software control of that switcher. So, and they're apparently their bus speed of transferring data into it over the USB or over the network is fairly slow. As you can watch those images come in when you start it, they load in fairly slow. For even a JPEG, it takes 4 or 5 seconds for each JPEG to come in. And so as you expand the number, it's going to take very much longer to boot up and get up to a usable state with your media center.
Yeah, I don't think it's designed to do what we're trying. Once we go over that, we just have external systems if we're going to get something that's more complex. While it's very slow, it's way faster than the Panasonics. We had a Panasonic 400 or whatever that it felt like an hour per image. Next question.
Pretty broad question coming in from Douglas Carmichael for this next one. And he says, how can we amplify the positive social and societal impacts of the concepts and ideas we have developed in office hours?
By the way, we are going to run a little over and just finish these last 3 questions. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Watch very carefully because history is being made right here for a lot of reasons. Some of them technical, some of them are cultural. And with success comes copying, and other people will follow suit. Based on the success of Office Hours 2.0 and what's been built here prior to that time, showing people that you don't have to have harsh language and fissionable commentary. You can still have a educational and entertaining program. So it's happening right here in front of you.
Yeah, and I think that the main thing is that, again, the first step is for us to expand where Office Hours is getting to reach the largest audience. And the second thing is for people eventually, when they're ready, to take what we figured out here and apply it to their own communities, to their own interests and communities and so on and so forth. So the goal is that as people feel like they're ready to do that, and I'm just 100, if anyone wants to, we can have a conversation about that at some point, but I'm happy to share more about the thought process of how I approach it, at least, and then people can decide whether they like that or not. Next question.
Moving into the area of audio for performance, Underworld, Douglas Carmichael asks, Underworld, the UK Live Electronic Dub Music Act, uses an SSL L500 live sound console as an instrument on stage to perform their music. Wouldn't there be mix issues with the performer not hearing what the audience is hearing at front of house?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, the SSL, by the way, is this particular console is a very high-end console, and it's a little unclear to me how they're really using this, but it doesn't sound like it's replacing someone mixing front of house for the audience. So I wouldn't think there would be any issue really for the front of house audience to be hearing. Yeah.
Next question.
Moving back to where we were a little bit earlier in Olathe, Kansas, for Michael Andreas, and he says, if a wired connection to the internet gateway is not an option, is a Wi-Fi mesh dedicated to the production with the head unit wired to the gateway the next best option?
Go ahead, Rupert.
I think that would be my absolute last option. I quite often see when you can't get a wired connection to where you can, I quite often find that you can get it part of the way. So can you get a wire, from your router part of the way and then from your production part of the way and then join the gap with a point-to-point wireless link, not a mesh?
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, mesh causes too much jitter, so I would not use the mesh. However, I would also plan to be using Wi-Fi 6 over anything else because that's made to actually transport video as well. Keep it dedicated. Don't put it on a network that's already got your cameras and your thermostat or anything else on there. So it's as point-to-point as possible.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, wired wherever you can. Any kind of flavor of Wi-Fi is just a compromise all the way down the line. So try to get wired and you're going to be in good shape.
Okay. We are now changing subjects and moving into audio trends. What do we think that the future holds for us in the audio world over the next it can be out into the distance. We'll say a year, but if we want to talk about where we think things are going overall, we can definitely do that. We've got questions and comments already stacking up, so we'll go ahead and jump into that and just kind of fill in our opinions as we go through that. So if you have questions or comments you want us to discuss, go ahead and throw them into Makana, and we'll go ahead and jump into the first question.
As we change topics, the first one that's coming in from Morgan Price, Victoria, British Columbia in Canada, says, for podcasts and audio first shows, what trends do the panelists see to augment the audience's experience with other media beyond the typical sound bites to Instagram, Twitter, and so forth?
Go ahead, Sky.
Well, because I'm not commuting in my car and sitting in traffic, I've found myself not listening to as many podcasts that I had recently adopted as a way of in getting more information, getting more opinions, getting more ideas, and or being entertained. And so I think the location is also modifying our consumption of this question.
Yeah, I think that again, the gold standard for me when it comes to an audio podcast, I mean, it doesn't really do with snippets, but is This American Life. If you listen to how they compose what they're doing, it's not just put together. It's, they're giving you a lot of natural sound, nat audio that is there, that is, you're pulling in, that gets you into the space, and you're hearing all these little bits and pieces. And NPR in general is pretty good at that process of having you feel, creating a theater in your mind with the music, or with the audio, not music, but just sound effects. I think that, and I'm going to say this probably 8 times during this hour, that as podcasts start to support spatial, it's going to be more and more important for us to think about how we compose in spatial. And so creating that environment in a spatial environment, I think that you're going to see, that's going to be something that you can publish to for podcasts. And so I think that is going to be something that's going to become more and more interesting, of having people really feel like they're enveloped into it. I don't think that, I have to admit that for the most part, all the sound effects and little hits and everything else I find to be annoying as a listener. And I have to admit that they sound different to me, because I think this is something that I just thought about recently, is they sound differently to me because I'm listening at 2x. So if your sound effects that you thought sounded really cool sound really odd to a person, and I know very few people that listen at 1x. So I mean, I know that there's probably people on the panel say I listen to 1x, but I can't even. I get upset when I turn something on and I can't speed it up because it sounds like everybody's talking in slow motion around me. So I think that's an interesting puzzle. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I agree with Alex about the little sound effects and little things that can be annoying. The only exception to that would be talk over music in the open and the close of the show. If you have music that you can sneak in underneath as an announcement for, coming up next week, et cetera, sneak that in, and it makes it sound more like a well-produced radio show. The problem is a lot of podcasts are done live, and so the level of production that's needed to do This American Life, that kind of stuff, those are heavily edited and heavily produced.
Months.
They work on those things for months, and each producer who goes out in the field and collects interviews also collects all that ambient sound, and they turn that over to the producers, the mixers of the show, and they bring that in as needed to establish that feeling and to bridge the little pauses when changing locations, etc. And that works really well, but you can't really do that live very easily. So that's going to be the difference between a well-produced radio show and a podcast that's just done direct to air or direct to tape and then put out later.
And I have to say that I've never done I've done a couple podcasts, and I've never done a podcast that goes direct out the way I recorded it. I mean, everything's edited, so we do everything in channels. For the most part, when I've done podcasts, I haven't done them recently because, to your point, Courtney, they're a lot of work, or at least the way I do them. And so we end up, we have people go through and pull out all the breaths, which even NPR doesn't. And I'm just going to give you a red pill. Every once in a while, I have to give you guys red pills. There's a lot of breathing in on NPR. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. You're not thinking about it right now because they do these Neumanns and they just have this really high quality. But you'll hear that all the time as they get into it, and it drives me.
Their compression artifact makes me crazy.
Yeah, but you can hear the breathing in all the time. Once you know that it's there, you'll just hear it all the time. Mitchell?
Yeah, I'm a former radio show host that did a morning zoo kind of program with all the drop-ins and sound effects. And at the time, I thought I was being creative and trying to add some content, but that was the 80s, folks. People don't want to hear that anymore. And if you're emulating a radio show, they don't do that anymore. So leave the sound effects and the little jumper noises and drop-ins. Leave them out.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't like listening to any of that anymore. I just want people to get to the point. I don't even like it when The Economist has like some little weird thing at the beginning. I listen to The Economist, and they have these little things between every. And when you listen to the whole magazine that way, it's super annoying. Next question.
Next one comes to us from Flagstaff, Arizona, and Aaron Giancarella says, have any panelists used Frame.io with a Sound Devices recorder on a project? And if so, can you tell us how well it worked?
I haven't used it yet. I keep on looking for opportunities to use camera to cloud, and I have the tools to do it. I have the Scorpio and everything else. I just haven't had the opportunity or the need. We keep on thinking we're going to hand it off to editors that fast, and then we didn't need to, or we had some kind of connectivity issue. So I've heard that it works very well with the 8 series, but I haven't tested it. But I think that one trend I think we're going to see is more and more of being able to get stuff from the set to the editors and to people while you're still on the set. And what's really interesting about that is being able to take notes while you're there. So we've done this in the past. So we haven't done camera to cloud, but we've done it where people are taking notes during a show. And oftentimes that happens, for like Twit. People are taking notes, and they'll every once in a while there'll be a request, go back and just say this again, or go back and do this again. You can only do that if someone's listening in real time to that process or watching it in real time to that process. And so I think that being able to get those notes, and I think that the power of camera to cloud is the ability for an editor to be sitting there putting together the scene that you're shooting and assembling it actually in the edit, and then realizing, I could, if I had one more close-up of the hands or the pan or something else, I could cut around something. Or if I just had a wide shot here, I could do something before we break the set down. And this could apply to both audio and video. Before you break the set down, you can just go back and do a pickup. Pickups are really painful when you do them 3 months later, when you have to rebuild the set and do all the costumes again. Whereas if you could it'd be worth productions oftentimes having an extra couple hours at the end of each day to pick up from the shots that they had based on the editor notes. It might drive some directors crazy that the editor would be able to ask for those things, but I think it would make a better movie. Go ahead, Sky.
Yes, that's what we're doing in January. Our editor is going to be watching the show and doing the circle takes. Previously on a live event for a corporate experience, I was the one that was taking the best takes, or circle takes as they're referred to. But this next show we're doing in January, there is software that allows that all of the time code is either time of day on all the cameras. And so we've got an 80% head start of, we're just going to use the cherries at the beginning, but also know that there's other options behind it, because the editor is actually physically taking the notes with time code lock.
Well, and in this case, we're talking about the editor being able to cut it into a sequence and see how that looks. Next question.
Next question comes to us out of British Columbia, Victoria, and Morgan Price asks it. And he says, do the panelists recommend any real-time audio plugins or processing units that can reduce mouth clicks? Is there anything similar to Isotope RX mouth declick, but real-time?
Go ahead, Andrew.
My favorite plugin for this is something called H2O. And that really helps. You put water, give it to the person speaking, and don't give it to them in a bottle that crinkles, because you'll just be replacing one sound for another. And I don't use any audio plugins, actual audio plugins for this.
We need to have a glass that just called the declick filter, and it's just a glass of water or like a little drink bottle. Yeah. Go ahead, Mitchell.
I'm with Andrew on this. It's best to avoid them in the first place, and then you don't have to rely on a plug-in, which is usually overused or underused. And don't eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich before you got something to read or do on camera, because it's just going to be a problem. And the H2O plugin that Andrew has works great.
That's great. Go ahead, Bill.
I was also going to say that to a certain degree, that is a performance problem. So be aware of it. If you are the performer, it is your responsibility to deliver as clean an audio performance as you can. And if you are hearing the fact that you are clicking in certain circumstances, drill down and figure out what it is. Do you need a sip of water? Do you need something else? Is your mic position too close such that it's emphasizing mouth sounds over the content you're delivering? I mean, this is your business now if you're going to be a performer, so pay attention to what you're doing.
Next question.
Moving on, we're going to move to one from Andrew Lipnick, who was just speaking from San Francisco, and he says, how do you see AI and machine learning impacting the role of live audio engineers now and in the future?
Go ahead, John.
As it turns out, the eyes and ears are not that good of bandpass filters. And once I get my Neuralink installed, I'm looking forward to listening to the whales talk and the porpoises talk at up to about 150K and down to about 14 hertz out in the Pacific Ocean.
Okay, good, Chris.
I see it doing kind of what we just talked about in the previous question, dealing with things in real time, like mouth clicks, room noise, things like that, where it's calculating it in real time in a much more intelligent way than even what, Sound Devices plugin can do right now. And it's just doing it so fast that it's beyond our perception, but it's still happening in real time. That's a educated guess.
Good, Courtney.
Yeah, you're seeing things like now look ahead limiters that, they cause a slight delay, but an imperceptible delay, and will look ahead into the stream, delay the stream, and automatically grab things that are going over and bring them back down and normalize them. So they're being used right now. As far as artificial intelligence to do real-time stuff, probably not very much, but to handle in post-production, I think it'll give you a lot more time on your own, because it can take care of those routine tasks that can require several passes in a software filter and so on. It can take the time to do it.
I think you'll see better noise reduction. We're seeing a little bit of that when you're talking about noise assist and the cedar. But I think that also, if you look at the RTX filters, that's basically machine learning, or that's looking for things and separating the voice out from the background. So I think that it could theoretically do some of those things. If you look at what Apple is doing with stereo tracks, they are processing the stereo tracks and pushing them into an immersive experience where they're putting the instruments back in. They're pulling them out and putting them back in, and separating them out from what was kind of stereo mush and putting them in. And it makes it sometimes very hard to understand unless they label it. It's hard to understand which tracks are not great Atmos and which tracks are actually, or just stereo. And when it's great Atmos, you can tell the difference. But when it's just okay Atmos, that sounds almost the same as what Apple's doing in the spatialization. And where that has to do with audio engineering is one of the big challenges we have in spatial live specifically is crossover between the mics, is bleed, that's bleeding into all the mics, so if you have amps or if you have drums, or all those things start to feed into all the other mics, and it makes it very hard for us to put it into different places because they're all together, and you don't get to put them somewhere else because you can hear part of the drums in the vocals or in something else. And so being able to use machine learning to say, to correct for that and to pull, basically, I hear the drums on this mic, I hear the drums on this flute, or I hear the drums slightly in this flute. I can use one to filter the other one out. But in real time, being able to do that so that I can have the flute good, bounce around or whatever I want it to do during that piece. That's a huge challenge for spatial mixing is to deal with that. I think also what we're seeing here, what we're building into 2.0, is the ability to manage just not music, but just manage the details of the folks here. So, for instance, one of the things we're going to be doing in the future is when someone's speaking. Now the reader and the host will probably remain open, but when someone else is speaking, pushing something in Mukana literally turns everybody's mics off. You're unmuted, and when we cut to you, we are going to ask all of you just to leave your mics alone. And when we call out Courtney or Andrew, we will literally open it. It will automatically open your mic from the back end instead of the fore end. So there's things that can be done that can logistically manage things as well down the path. Next question.
And moving on, Aaron Husledge in Durham, North Carolina is back with audio production in the cloud has been somewhat problematic as the tools available are not nearly as far along as the ones for video. How can we address this with various vendors and developers?
I go, Jeffrey.
Well, you got two main problems when you're doing audio over the cloud, and one is just the latency that comes back to you, and the other one is the quality. If you get any type of compression out of that, then you're not hearing what you need to change, and then of course your changes might come in a little bit too late, and go from there. Now, with that said, we got companies like Elk that are working on reducing that as best as possible. Once those start to really get addressed, I think then we'll have some tools that we'll be able to use to modify and make some awesome changes.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
It's being done successfully for radio broadcasters. For example, the folks at Omnia and Orban both have cloud-based processing products that there may be some latency, but they're rock solid because that's the way broadcasters go.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, and tools like Harrison Mixed Bus have already addressed some of these things. There's an integrator that called Advanced Systems Group where they bring the audio and video go up to one point in the cloud, and then you can pull it down, which really reduces issues around latency in processing, just like different paths of audio and video. There's some videos on YouTube around this. You can look it up.
I think the biggest problem is that a lot of times audio tends to be a spaghetti of so many things because it's so many layers of things. Video tends to be, there's some graphics and there's some other things that are sitting over top of it, but video is far simpler than audio when it comes to how many things you have to deal with at one time. And so I think that that's part of the challenge with audio. Next question.
Moving very technical again, Aaron Jen Carell in Flagstaff, Arizona says, what does the panel think about IP-based frequencies used for wireless microphones?
Go ahead, Andrew.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think it's maybe wireless systems typically that are working in the 2.4 gigahertz area. Like I believe the Rode Go works in that area. I'm personally not a big fan of those because my concern is if I'm at an event and we've tested everything with those types of mics, and then a lot of people show up and they've turned on their Wi-Fi, how will that impact? I know that some of you on the panel perhaps have had success with that. That said, there are some very high-end wireless microphone systems. There's one from Audio-Technica called Atros, which works actually at 6.5 gigahertz. And they used it, I believe, at the US Open Tennis in 2018 with great success.
Here you go, Jason. Courtney?
Yeah, I agree with what Andrew was saying. A lot of if you're going to be using it for your own production and you're out in the field and you're the only person around, should work fine. You're competing in an unlicensed bandwidth area, 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. And so there's no restrictions. Anybody can use that, and Wi-Fi all uses that. And, so you're competing with everybody else who has a phone in their pocket. And the other thing to deal with is all IP-based transmissions, packet-based transmissions, so there is going to be delay. So if you're going to use that wireless mic in a sound reinforcement situation where you're going through live speakers, you're going to run into echo and delay, which is going to complicate things in a sound reinforcement. So I would not use IP-based. I'd use licensed radio transmission on licensed frequencies for amplification in a venue, and not use any type of IP-based transmitters.
Next question.
Moving into the world of Dante audio, the next question comes from JHB in New York, and he says, coming from an analog mixer background, what's the best way to gain a working knowledge of Dante audio setup and use? And thanks.
Go ahead, Craig.
First thing I would look at is the Dante website, the Audinate website, for their training classes. They've got 3 levels that are all online. You can also access a simulator from there where you can do some work just in a simulator. After that, I'd look at getting, I know it's not popular, but not only DVS, Dante Virtual Sound Card, but VIA. You can buy the two of them as a package deal. It's usually a lot cheaper, and a simple dongle 2-channel device to actually practice with, get some hands-on work on it.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, what Craig said, and also that you don't have to buy a digital mixer. You can just buy some Dante devices, Dante Virtual Sound Card, and Dante Controller, more importantly, because that will show you the matrix for routing sends and receives, inputs and outputs. They call them transmitters and receivers, and that will get you started.
Next question.
Desktop speakers are on our radar next, from Stefan Fischer in Würzburg, Germany, who says, what speaker set of your desktop would the panel recommend listening to the upcoming audio technologies? Would it be, for example, active or passive speakers? Which would be better?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Definitely active. I currently have a set of Genelecs, which I love to death. I've had them for 20 years. But the future is lots of speakers. You could have 7 speakers floating around your room. And if you have that, your best bet is to go with an IP-based speaker. It allows you to make all kinds of adjustments and synchronize and control the audio. That's the way to go. So I like Genelec, but that's my personal taste.
I go ahead, Craig.
I agree 100% on the active. I've got Genelecs as well. They're great. I would just make sure that if you're going to get into this, make sure whatever you buy is going to be a product that's going to be around for a while. So if you want to start off with just a stereo set and then work your way up to more of a surround kit, you're going to have access to the speakers later.
Good. Jeffrey?
Depending on how much you're testing the quality of the audio that you're putting together, I would actually have both, so I could run it through an active and run it through a passive and see what the differences are. I'd also have a whole bunch of different sets of headphones and other types of speakers that I'd try it through as well.
Good, Bill.
One of the classic approaches is to have multiple sets of speakers. There is a class called near-field monitors that are designed for right in front of you. In the old days of radio, we used to have big speakers to make sure we could hear everything in the audio track, but we would also switch to the little bridge speakers to make sure that you understood what it sounded like to your audience when it was coming out of a small radio or television set. I think that's still a good approach today.
Yeah, I want to make sure that personally, I want the speakers to have an XLR in, so active. so because I just want to be able to know that I have that control. The one thing I will say is if you're thinking about it, think about scale. If you're going to get a stereo set of speakers, make sure that you're going to be happy with them when you either happy with them or can afford to put 7 more in or 9 more in or whatever. I'm right now building really a 714 system, and I chose less expensive speakers that I think will be sufficient, but I want them all to be the same. They're not Genelecs, they're JBLs, and I bought them because I could afford them. I could afford, not that I could afford 2, but I could afford 9. So that was or 12 of them, and that was the issue, is that I had to be able to afford all of them at one time as opposed to that. So you want to think about that too, because mixing and matching the speakers will be very hard if you decide to go into to add them all together. Next question.
All right, moving on. The next question comes to us from Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, and he says, will we see a trend toward more acoustic consideration in workspace design, particularly in meeting and hybrid spaces?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yes, because we have to. And people are getting more sophisticated in what they're doing and what they expect out of their spaces. And I'm so glad that architects are catching on, because I worked very, very hard to try to convince people when they're spending money on design to please spend a little bit more time on making sure the acoustic space is designed correctly, because it's so much easier to fix a problem when it's being designed than it is after the fact.
Bill?
We can only hope that this will be one more nail in the coffin of cubicles in offices, because if you have everybody having to do audio and video, cubicle farm is probably the worst single design that you can imagine.
Go ahead. Let's see here. So I don't know if that's, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about backstage for a second. Bill, are you hitting that where it's going forward? Or?
I think that time I did. My mouse had not moved off when I went to click on
we're
something
like 2
else.
questions. We skipped it. We skipped like 2 questions that way. So yeah, you got to be careful. Go ahead, Sky.
Thank you. I think this is the concept of what do we look and sound like is like what Brooks Brothers was when the suit was the thing in business. And I think this concept of looking good and sounding good is slowly starting to realize that it's the individual's responsibility to do that. And so the audio acoustics of a space, yes, I'm hoping that will be a trend, because we're getting really tired of bad audio.
What we saw, I was actually brought in to do some consulting early or not early, but mid 2020, the time when we were supposed to be done with the pandemic, one of the first false starts where everyone was starting to go back to the office. And what happened is that an executive C-level got into a virtual meeting where they were remote, and they were horrified. They would like, what went wrong with the conference room? And we had to break it to them that they're not me, but somebody had to break it to them like, that's the way it's always been. Like, and then they said, you mean everybody that's called in has heard this room this way for the last decade? And the answer was yes. And then I understand that there was a long string of expletives and angry yelling and screaming, and this, and then I was brought in to talk to them about the reason I heard the story was I was brought in to talk about how to fix all the conference rooms in the headquarters was, and I just said, doesn't matter what's on the screens. Like, we don't need any of these whiteboards anymore. You have one whiteboard that you can draw on, like, and then no glass, just get rid of all of this. Just go soft everywhere. And you're going to get to something that you can start to make sense. But what it took was an executive who's always been in the meeting, in the conference room, to hear it from the other end. All of us that have consulted for all these big companies for a decade have heard the insanity that literally you're looking down, holding your ears, trying to figure out what people are saying. And I think that time is over, because there's no reason, like, people are just not going to want to, especially now. As people slightly get better home things, I prefer to have everybody at home than anybody in a conference room at the office, or anyone in the office. The problem right now is that I don't want to meet with people when they're at the office because they sound so bad. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think we'll see a trend of getting away from minimalist design for sure. I think having stuff in the room is the single best thing to do. Anecdotally, I watch a podcast by Kevin Smith and Mark Bernard, and it's called Fat Man Beyond. And Mark is in a rental space with a high-end mic, but it's an empty room. And then Kevin is using his laptop mic, but his room is populated with all kinds of stuff on his bookshelves behind him. And Kevin sounds light years ahead of Mark.
And it's just, it literally can just be soft walls. There's like acoustic, like sure. I work in a room, I worked in a room that basically has 3 inches so that it looks completely flat and perfect, but it's fabric, not, when you put your hand up against it, you realize it's fabric, and then underneath it is more absorption. And it's just the most beautiful sound all the time. So it still looks minimalist, still looks clean, but it sounds amazing. And that's the kind of thing that I think people are going to think a lot more in the future. Go ahead, Courtney.
And early,
you can't do that, Courtney.
Yeah, and I think actually the trend will not go that way. I think the trend is, as there's more and more money going into bigger and bigger corporations, they always opt for opulence, the appearance of the room and the appearance of the offices, as a representation of the size of the company. And so they hire interior designers that make a glass fishbowl for the conference rooms, or they have vault high marble ceilings because they look very opulent in a conference room where they really don't need to have high marble ceilings, or in an executive's office.
But I think everybody's rethinking a lot of those things. I mean, they've had those things, but a lot of times we find that environmental impacts change the way people design offices. The old ones will look the way that they look, but the new ones tend to take into account what people decide is important. And again, someone asked why it's important for us to expand office hours. This is part of it. If we have 100,000 people listening and we talk about how bad their audio is, that eventually gets back from a couple different directions to the decision makers that are doing that. But I agree with you that that's been the case. But now I think it's more important to look good on camera. Those offices have to look good. Those conference rooms, I'll tell you, the other problem is it's really hard to make a conference room look good on camera. It mostly looks like a conference room. So we've spent an enormous amount of effort making that work as well. But I think, like, for instance, the open office, I mean, that's the reason people don't want to go back. One of the big reasons is no one wants to go back to an open office. And so they're going to have to redesign all of that too, which will make for better people jumping on too, because their little cubicles or whatever they get next will look better on camera. Next question.
Our next question comes from Gordon Lake in Los Angeles. And he says, for audio snakes, will audio over fiber or Ethernet be a good alternative to DT12?
I go ahead, Andrew.
So it already is, especially for long runs. I just did a few shows where that was the case, where we were using fiber for long runs. DT12 still have their place. They're great for subsnakes. For example, I had to hook up a video room.
Can you define for people what a DT12 is?
Oh, I'm sorry. It is a snake system. You see it a lot on broadcast trucks, but it also gets used elsewhere, which is 12 channels of audio.
But it's analog. It's like
purely analog.
It's like a big connector with a bunch of pins.
Absolutely. It's a big connector. It's a standard. Fortunately, it's somewhat of a standard certainly with trucks, but I shouldn't speak to that because I don't work a lot on trucks. But yes, but it makes for a great snake system if you just need like a lot of I/O to get to your digital snake that would eventually go to fiber to its destination.
Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I agree with Andy exactly with this. The only real place not to go with fiber or network cable at this point is if you're just doing a short run where you've got one stage rack or multiple stage racks, but you need to have sub snakes going out from there.
Yeah, Jeffrey.
Yeah, we've gotten rid of a lot. We call them the fire hoses, the DT12s, but we've gotten rid of a lot of them just because a lot of mixers can be actually placed on stage, and we can control them remotely via iPads. But if you're doing Ethernet or fiber runs, be very protective of that cable, because if somebody cuts over that and cuts that cable, that takes everything out in a heartbeat. So make sure you run it properly and have it nice and covered.
One of the things that we do is if there's two, a lot of Dante will have primary and backup, and so we want to run those. And the mistake we get, people put them into a switch, or they'll run them together, and we're like, that's not the point. The point is to run them two different directions, so that if one place gets cut, and with fiber, we've oftentimes run for large events, not so much stage events that we roll right into, but like in a CES when we've loaded into CES. We'll run 2 or 3 lines to every location over fiber because we're coming in 2 or 3 weeks before, and we usually lose about a third of our lines to forklifts. so you just put them all in there, and that's just the cost. People complain about it. How do we make it not work? How do we do that? I'm like, it's just too lossy. You can't. The best way to fix it is just to buy extra fiber. We don't terminate it because that's expensive. So we just run it all unterminated, and when we get there, we terminate the ones that survived. Next question.
Moving on, we're moving to Rupert McCrae in Dallas, Texas. And Rupert says, how can we influence a trend toward fewer people using open speakers in meetings?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
I use an open speaker during meeting, and I'm here to tell you that you have to have it adjusted exactly right. It's over my shoulder, behind me. I have processing that maintains a gate point that goes below the sound that would come from it, but the trend will be affected when people start abusing using open speakers, which is probably the point we are right now. So as more and more people are aware of what it sounds like without it and how good it can sound with ear sets, it's going to be a trend that is going to slowly fade away, and I'm going to go to earphones soon too.
Sky.
Well, I think earlier talking about the CEO that finally heard something, and I was introduced to the term the dog fooding of a thing. And that's where I actually heard it for the first time, how horrible a thing was. Then I would want to modify it very quickly. So until I think people believe it or see it themselves about themselves, they may not want to modify. So the consumption or the dog fooding of, maybe somebody else could explain the dog fooding of a concept.
Go ahead, Courtney.
In Zoom, you're dealing with echo cancellation, which you have to have turned on if you're going to have an open speaker. And the best place for an open speaker is not how Mitch has it, which is behind a directional microphone in the null point of the microphone. So in front of you, if you have the microphone pointed at your face. So that way it'll have the most amount of rejection from your microphone, unless your microphone's an Omni microphone. And the other thing is if you're not in a Zoom meeting or in a meeting situation that has good echo cancellation, you're going to run into feedback from the other people that are talking if your microphone is open.
Go ahead, Andrew.
If you have to have an open speaker in an event where there is Zoom and all of that, the volume should be as low as possible, just high enough so that people can hear, say, Q&A or whatever it is they need to hear. But it doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be audible.
As far as influencing the trend, it's actually one of the contributing factors to my general. I moved back to these. It just took me a little while to get used to them, but these are those. I can't think of the name of them. They're some long term that I don't know. They're not very good branded, but they're about $60-$70 in-ears. And one of the reasons is you can actually see them. With the Bumblebees, you couldn't see them. I still use the Bumblebees for the cooking and some of the other stuff, but I want you to see them. And I will oftentimes, part of the theater of me joining a meeting is putting one of them over my ear and putting it in right at the very beginning of the meeting. And that is communicating to everyone that I have headphones in. And my audio sounds, on most good days, sounds way better than everybody else's. That is a subtle, semi-passive aggressive way to push people towards putting headphones in. And I notice that more people in meetings will put headphones in because they see all of us putting headphones in, there. So I do a little bit of theater there to just, and I don't, of course with clients, I'm not going to tell them to put headphones in. Like I'm not going to communicate it. I communicate it just by showing them that I'm using a real mic and in headphones. And I notice that folks because what'll happen is it brings up a conversation. Hey, what are you using there? What are you doing there? And then I explain what I do and I explain why, that it's a lot easier for me to concentrate because I don't hear anything else, that my audio sounds way better, that I can have a more sensitive mic. I describe I have a kind of a tape that I turn on when a client, because a client will ask every meeting, when you're using especially when you're using a Neumann 102, client will ask you what your audio chain is every single meeting. So that's how I kind of spread the good word. Next question.
Next, we're moving on to Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York. And he says, what do you think is the better way to do remote mixing? Something like Unity Connect with direct multi-track Dante over IP, or remotely controlling a mixer via VPN?
And go ahead, Andrew.
So I have used hardware-based mixers to remote control one to another. We've done that actually in an earlier iteration of this show. I don't think that's the future. There's a piece of software, yes, that sits between these two pieces of hardware. I think the future is that the mixer itself is software-based. It's sitting in the cloud. You are remote controlling it with hopefully a piece of hardware. You're not doing it with your mouse and keyboard. You're using faders and buttons and all of that, but that's simply just a glorified mouse to help you control the show.
Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I've done a couple of shows like this. I've got an X-Touch Behringer that I use for control. But as far as the actual question about using it over multi-track over the internet, or just doing the I was just getting a stereo return feed, and all the mixing was being done at the far end, and then you're not using the bandwidth. I don't see any real need to bring every channel to where I am just to send back out a stereo feed.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Don't be too quick to react. Give it a couple seconds more and make sure that what you heard is actually what you heard to make the change, and then be a friend. Make the fine tune option your friend, because a lot of mixers have that little fine tune option when it comes to like an iPad control. So you're not really going to an extreme and then completely ruining whatever you're doing.
Yeah, we're digging into this pretty deeply at O&I for a couple of projects where we need to do a surround mix, but we want the engineers the folks that are on the ground not to have to deal with folks that are, not to have to deal with it. The thing that we're going to be testing like every different way of doing this. So I'll ask this in 6 months and I'll have a better answer, but I'm leaning towards a remote control over VPN into the hardware mixer. I don't think that the cloud is quite ready for what I'm trying to do, given that I may have 60 to 80 inputs that are, in a location that all need to be mixed into a surround system. I don't think that I'm not ready to put that in the cloud, and I'm also not ready to send that over from one place to another. So what I'm really thinking about right now is being able to have someone be able to listen to it, actually in a 514 space or something like that. that they can listen to that process but control the desk remotely. Because that to me allows me to have an infinite number of inputs in processing without having to send it somewhere else. It also is more stable if I have a multiple outputs from the location, that I can know that it's gonna, like it's still gonna work. Like if the person on the far end loses control, someone on the near end can at least, fly by wire to get the show finished, and so I don't know how I would do that in the cloud just yet. Go ahead, Craig.
So you just hit it right on the head there. I was going to say about the redundancy. If you're sending all the multi-track channels over, or if you're doing it in the cloud, if you have any connection issue, you're going to have a problem. If you're just doing a VPN, somebody else can grab this stick.
And that comes down to, I had a truck go bad, and all of my cameras were on triacs and without recorders. And so the client said, "You can record it locally, right? You can at least record the cameras, and we can post it later." And I was like, "No." I can't without the truck. I can't do it. So I view the cloud like that. Like if I lose connectivity, I can't even have a local recording of the system. And so I'm leaning towards, again, being able to remote control the mixer itself. But that it's complicated because a lot of the higher end desks that we need for that are not super remote controllable. So that's the thing we're trying to figure out. Next question.
This question comes in from Chris Reidner in Lafayette, Indiana. And Chris says, Rode has been improving their software tools for the wireless Go. Where do we hope this software will evolve?
Go ahead, Roscoe.
Well, two things. One is I'd love for it to be a miniature audio hijack. So something where it already does virtual routing for its own products, but it doesn't allow in any third-party products. So I'd love if they'd open it up a little bit and let one or two third-party products get into their little remixers. It'd be a consumer version of audio hijack with maybe pre-canned or simple. And the second part is, since the Rode Pro, I'll get the Rode Pro 2, Pro 2s record directly on board the microphones up to, I believe, like almost 20 hours. You can get in there if you're using the right settings. I'd love to copy that. Is a little app that Otherworld Computing gives away for free, which really easily unloads stuff from a iOS device. I'd love if there was an easy way to offload the files.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
To me, the Rode Go is perfect for a camera situation, interview situation where the camera is only a couple feet away. Getting anything bigger, you can run into a lot of problems. So I don't know. As for evolution, the only thing that I could think of with evolution for Rode would actually come out with a camera with the Rode receiver built into it, so you just have one less piece of hardware to worry about.
Next question.
This question comes in from James Babbitt in San Diego, California, and he says, when office hours includes Atmos, will viewers need special equipment? Would it work for viewers using late model iPhones or iPads or Macs?
It should work just fine with the latest Apple products, and then we will do the best we can to support. We should see better support on PC and Android over next year. This year, it's been rough. So I think that they're a little behind because they just don't have as much control over their ecosystem. Like that's the problem, is that every manufacturer does it differently because it's not a centralized ecosystem that just moves forward. On the Apple platform, it's relatively easy to implement. So you'll probably see it first there. I don't think, to put it in perspective though, I want to separate 5.1 from Atmos. What you're going to see in the spring is most likely 5.1. Atmos is probably a 2023 thing at the moment. That's, from our perspective, we'll just want to get 5.1 working first, and we might go in a little earlier. We might have it'll be the same thing that you see here. There'll be tests for a long time before we actually flip the switch on 5.14, 7.14 live. Next question.
Next on our voted up questions queue is from Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York. And he says, where do you put any more than 2 near field speakers in your setup when you have 6 displays on your video production desk?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Actually, I might have misunderstood this question, but I was just trying to figure out where to put 2 speakers in this situation. So, and if I can answer that part of it, the rule is a triangle. So the distance between the 2 speakers is the distance that you are from one of those speakers. It's a perfect triangle. And this is what I've learned in the last, few months here. Also, if you've got a long rectangular room, to pull the front of the speaker 1/5 of the distance of the total room into the space. If you look online for Dyn Audio, I believe is who has these videos. they have their own acoustician explaining all of this in much more detail.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing this, so you'll see more of that as we get into it. I took a little bit of a break because I needed to model some stuff that I haven't been able to have time to sit down to do, but I'm doing that this week, and I've been making some progress around my studio. But what you'll see me doing is inserting either a 714 or 514 into a rig around myself, and I'll be figuring out. Part of the biggest problem, to get back to this question, is figuring out where to put all the speakers. So the hardest one is the center speaker for me. The other ones are actually relatively easy because the first three are in a relatively, as Andy said, is a pretty straightforward thing. It's the center speaker where my speaker, I have a monitor, and do I move the monitor up? Do I move it? Like where do I put that center speaker is where I'm kind of, thinking through that process. But then the other speakers are relatively straightforward from my perspective. There is some very specific math, but a lot of that math and diagrams are online. And what really matters from the speaker position is, the speaker position is important, and so is the dB level at my head's position, which is what you'll see me working on in January. Next question.
And we're moving on. The next question comes to us from Roscoe Jones in Brea, California. And he says, could surround be used effectively in a live studio show by assigning talent or special effects to a direction with 360-degree panning, or should it best be left to shows going through post? And will surround sound ever come to radio or to podcasting?
Go ahead, Andrew.
The short answer is no, because as humans, at least I feel, we are designed to have a voice come from right in front of us. And you can experiment with this by just listening to a radio show where you pan the voice all the way to one side and everything else, music, whatever it is, to the other side. So that's the quick answer, is maybe as humans, we need to be retrained or open up our senses a bit more. I don't know.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, we tried this back, it was probably before most of you were born, when radio was experimenting with SX, or quadraphonic transmission. And we'd get to do cute things like do an interview with putting one person in their right rear and left rear, and people became so annoyed with it because it didn't fold down correctly into stereo, and it distracts you, having a person that you're supposed to be listening to coming from behind your head. Is too distracting, and so I think we end up mixing everything as far as vocals and dialogue into the center channel.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
And with podcasting, yeah, it's actually already being done. It's been done for a long time, starting with the binaural podcasts, especially for those people that like to do the unwrappings. I always forget the acronym, so I'm not going to say where they unwrap in front of the microphone, and they want you to hear it, and they want you to hear it over here and over here. So that's already being done.
Yeah, and I think that here's what I can say is that people will do it because Apple is going to promote podcasts that are spatial. Like I don't have any inside information. I'm just telling you that if Apple's going down the path of spatial, what's going to happen is the front board on podcasts will be podcasts that are there'll be a whole shelf at some point that's called spatial, and you'll be able to get lots and lots and lots of new viewers because of that shelf. And so people will start figuring out ways to do it. I do think that people will overuse it, most likely, like they do every new technology. We are going to experiment in our end of just slight pans, for people that are in front of you. So I find that Blue Jeans does this automatically right now. It uses a Dolby process to kind of push people around, and it actually works pretty well for me. And it creates a different, kind of space that I think is interesting. I think what I'm more interested in, and you'll hear us do this at some point or experiment with it with the 5.1. And again, the reason that we're adding 5.1 and HDR to office hours is not because we think that a talk show should be in 5.1 in office hours. It's because we get to practice daily, and go, we love this, we hate this, we love this, we hate this, and so it makes all of us smarter, so that when a client asks us to do HDR, all of us have thought about it, or a client asks us to do surround, all of us have thought about, what works and what doesn't. And so I think in a discussion where you might feel like you're in a restaurant, you might hear some clinking and clanking and little things that are very minor, very subtle behind you, and it can create a space. One of the things to note about spatial is that the surround channels, when used correctly, make the folks that are right in front of you sound more present. So what happens is that psychologically, your mind creates a space around it based on what it hears. So it's hearing a bunch of things, and it decides how big the room is and where people are and where a person is. And so I've literally had an example done where you're listening for 6 or 7 minutes to tons and tons of audio around, and then the singer appears in the center, and you've never heard anyone sound so in front of you before. So even if we take the people who are speaking and we don't, and they stay right in the center, adding ambient sounds around it very, very subtly is cueing your mind to think about the space. And you're literally, if you think about almost like Daredevil, all those little things is how Daredevil would picture a space around them. What happens with spatial audio is if you do it well for a good designer, they're creating a space for the center track to exist. And I know that sounds like, but that's what you want to think about in spatial is not that we're putting the center track all over the place. It's that we're using all these channels to set up the main piece and have it be present for you. And so you're going to see us experiment a lot with that as we move forward with office hours. Next question.
Next one comes up from R.J. Rude in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He says, when wearing in-ear monitors, is it commonly best practice to have an Omni or room mic mixed into your ears, not sent out, for safety awareness of your environment? For example, smoke or carbon dioxide alarms or monoxide alarms, knock at the door, person approaching out of sight, or so forth.
Go ahead, Chris.
I don't have custom earbuds. I just have the SE215s, the Shure, and with whatever it came with, the little foam pads. Mm-hmm. I can hear things just fine, probably more than I even want to, but I think it's so much easier just to pull one out or get rid of one than to go through the process of mixing a mic back into the signal in a way that I can hear it, but the rest of you can't. Mm-hmm. I couldn't even do that with my current setup. I think it's so much easier and simpler just to pull one out. But I don't have the experience that maybe somebody has with.
I don't think I would do that. But anyway, yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
So there are a couple companies that make in-ear monitors that actually have microphones facing out, and mostly for on stage so they can hear the crowd, but you can definitely use it that way. I'd go for more of a visual cue because you can take an Amazon Echo and a security camera, for example, or a doorbell, and when somebody rings that doorbell, that camera goes off. You can have that right on the other side of your camera so you can see that something's going on, and either you can react to it or you can ignore it from there.
Go ahead, Bill.
I don't remember any kind of headphones that I've ever worn unless I was listening to excruciatingly loud and bad for me audio that would stop a smoke alarm siren from going off and me being able to perceive it. So I'm not sure if you're not overthinking this a little bit too much. I do know that in radio we do have visual cues, lights and things like that for smaller sounds that you still have to get to. So if your wife is having a baby or something and you want some notification of that and give somebody that number, I think you can do it off audio. But I've never heard of this happening. I don't think it's going to be a big thing.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, one thing to consider is stereo monitoring versus mono monitoring in 2 ears. Because your brain, as Alex was alluding to earlier about the surround sound, your brain differentiates between the locations of sounds by the phase difference between the 2 ears. And so your brain can then filter out stuff you don't want to listen to based on its location, and you just start your brain just starts ignoring that stuff and will focus on something in a specific point in space. Now, if you're monitoring in mono with the same signal feeding both ears, you lose that ability to locate that stuff in physical space in your brain, and so you hear everything mixed together. You'll hear all the noises, and that's best. That's why a lot of audio mixers that do production sound always monitor in mono in both ears, because then they'll hear all the stuff that goes out to the audience who's listening in mono, whereas they won't be fooled by their brain and not hearing the little ticking noise going on, the little squeak that's going on over there, or something else that's going on over there that your brain psychoacoustically tunes out.
I actually know quite a few engineers that have a separate mixer that they're oftentimes a simpler mixer that they are mixing a lot of different things into. They're mixing their comms, they're mixing exterior audio, a lot of other things. It's not the main mixer because they don't want to accidentally pipe the extra information into the system, but it's oftentimes a sub mixer that is taking their program out, potentially some other auxes, to what they're doing, as well as the comms. And I've seen them pan those comms. So clients are on one side, production's on another side. They have all these, and they create a very complex system of doing it. And it seems like they all do it differently. They all tune it. And I've had a couple of them sit there and talk about where they put everything and how they do it. But some of the engineers can get very complex about how they build their audio pipelines so that they have all the information they need, because a lot of them are sitting there for days, and they don't want to keep on popping something in and out. They don't want to keep changing something. They go in, they have all the information, and they're constantly tuning what they're hearing to create the best show. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael is up next, and he says, could you see second-tier audio networking platforms like Wave SoundGrid becoming less significant with Dante ruling the industry?
Andrew?
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. SoundGrid, in my view, is not an audio. It's not an IP audio over IP based system that replaces transport of audio like Dante is. They're two different things. Wave SoundGrid is great for managing your plugins and giving you some extra control over your audio, but it's not the same thing. And then beyond that, Dante is actually losing some ground in the industry. They've been very heavily affected by supply chain. And you're going to see more AVB. There's a new one. Well, it's not new. It's been around a few years, called Milan. You're going to see that. A lot of manufacturers who make speakers that have some sort of IP-based audio transport in them are abandoning Dante and going to other systems. Yamaha, who is well known as a Dante licensee, is got this thing called, I can never get the name right, Twin Lane. So the industry is really changing, and I don't know. I can't predict how it's going to shake out. I think we need to give it another year or two, certainly beyond the pandemic.
Yeah, I think for a long time, Dante was the obvious choice. The problem really is they charged a premium for stability, and they haven't been able to deliver on stability. So they're having trouble with new Macs. They're having trouble with DVS. They're having trouble with VIA. So as they continue, they've been trying to expand and create new things, and they're not keeping the basics of it actually works every single time you turn it on. And when they do that, it's not that people are leaving them for that, but they're less shiny. And when they're less shiny, they're at a position where they can be displaced. And so we're seeing, to Andrew's point, Ravenna, many, Milan, many, and then all the manufacturers have their own version of it because they want to have a version of this that doesn't require paying licensing. It made sense to pay for the licensing when it was front and center and always worked. It's making less sense every day because they're just simply not executing. So it'll be interesting to see how the next couple years go. Next question.
For this one, Mitchell Hill is diving into one of the scarier ideas. Will AI-generated voices replace real VO artists?
Go ahead, Roscoe.
My only experience with this is my Disneyland experience. When Jack Wagner, who was the voice of Disneyland for many years, passed away or was in his later years and unable to do his voiceover work, they recorded him doing all the phonetics, and then they would piece together the announcements. And as an employee who heard all these announcements, we could immediately identify, oh, that's a pieced together one. So I don't know if AI can overcome those types of things. I would say not yet.
Go ahead, Sky.
Well, I think you're asking, is it going to happen or is it a good idea? It's not a good idea, but it is happening because I've been on many a robocall that are using automated audio voices. So is it a good quality? I don't think so. But is it happening? I'm abused by it.
Here's the funny thing is that I'm listening to I've been listening to some of the not Audible, but Kindle books. So there's this funny workaround with Kindle on a iOS platform, is that to get Kindle to play, if you can tell the Alexa thing controller on your phone to play that book, it will play it out. It read it to you the way a Kindle will. It's like a little hack. So I've been listening to those, and they use synthesized audio. it is easier to listen to a book at speed with synthesized audio over top of a person. And I would have never said that, but it's cleaner, and I can actually listen to it at a higher rate than I can listen to a person reading an audiobook. And that's kind of frightening for me, but I have to admit that if I wasn't for non-fictional work, I would prefer. I actually have learned that I have the book in Kindle and the audiobook, and I've compared these head to head, and I would rather listen to the Kindle than listen to the person for a non-fictional book, because I can understand it better at a high rate, so from a pure absorbing information thing. Now, for understanding meditation or Harry Potter or other things like that, people are better. But at a straight data acquisition, and again, this is not something that I expected. It's just something that I kind of ran into as I started to play with the Kindle hack, that I would prefer to listen to a synthesized voice for that. So that might be somewhere where we see more of that. Next question.
Moving on, the next one comes in from Douglas Carmichael, and he says, in the NBA bubble last year, Firehouse Productions had 147 inputs on a single Digico SD7 at front of house. How do you manage that many inputs effectively? I could imagine it would take ages just to do the sound check.
Go ahead, Andy.
DCAs, or digitally controlled amplifiers, or VCAs, as they have been replaced by. DCAs have replaced VCAs, are your friend. So you're not having all your fingers and all those inputs. You have right in front of you, they're not technically subgroups. It's one fader controlling a bunch of inputs. And there's no audio, by the way, flowing through that fader. It's unlike a subgroup where audio is actually flowing through, a bunch of inputs are flowing through one fader. You're remote controlling a bunch of faders. So I don't know how to mix basketball. I've mixed very little sports in my day, but I would imagine that is what they did.
Yeah, a lot of those inputs for NBA, of course, are a lot of the court mics. I mean, they didn't send us all of them, but I worked on a basketball game where we were doing immersive, and so we asked for all the stems. They sent us the stems, not all the channels, and we got 27. So it was 27 stems over Dante for that process, and those are all the squeak, squeak, squeak that you hear from the So there's a whole bunch of mics that are grabbing onto the ball hitting the board, the squeak, squeak, squeaks across the bass. The audience, there's all these things that are all different pieces, and they're brought together to create the sound that you hear in broadcast. You would not hear any of that if it was just a handful of mics. And so there's tons and tons of microphones that are there, but they're not mixed into the show in the same way that you'd think. They're kind of an ambient mix that, as Andrew pointed out, basically they're bringing it up and down, they're bringing it in, and then they're going through in the back end and kind of playing with. But they only have to think about it in zones. They're not trying to mix it all in real time. Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh yeah, the other thing I should mention too is that a lot of those mics you don't even touch. You just leave them up because you've done some sort of not complete gating, but auto mic mixing to them.
And a lot of these are tweaked
or compression too, I should say.
A lot of these are tweaked over 50 or 60 games and left in year to year. I mean, when you're dealing with that many mics, you're not talking about we have to create something new every time. They're slowly built up, and you're doing 3 games a week. For a standard NBA team is doing playing that, and they'll have off weeks and on weeks and so on and so forth. But so they typically have an on week that's 3 home games and then an away, and then on and then away. That's kind of the general pattern, and so that allows the facility to book other things into this facility and so on and so forth. And so there's a whole bunch of pieces to that puzzle that happen there, and it's a slow build up, not a sudden thing. Next question.
The next question comes to us from Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York. And Scott says, when will virtual headphone mixing rooms like Waves and NX make speakers obsolete in your setup?
Go ahead, Bill.
I doubt they ever will in my setup. And the reason is this. I occasionally still have clients come over, a very small list of people who I know are safe to have come in. And when we're making group decisions about things like a voiceover to music balance, there's just nothing that gets away from the fact that speakers are important to understand how it's going to hear. But I got to tell you, I'm arguing a good little bit more and more these days for more separation between the voiceover and the music bed, only because I don't have any idea what the stakeholders are making the decisions are going to be listening to when they get this mix. I need to have the content carrying thing up as hard as it can make sense, because without that, if they put it on a phone, you may lose all of that, and I'll have all sorts of questions about content that I don't want.
Go, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'd always have a secondary source, and the secondary source will be an open set of speakers, so I can hear how it sounds from a slight distance. And I know we could digitally set that up to make that work, but I'd have to really trust that to just do it through one source.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I don't think it'll ever be obsolete. You can reproduce it for a mixing, and you should check your mixes on speakers, because nothing really can replace the fact that there's a lot of stuff in between our ears. You know, this thing, the skull and all that, the physiology of it all, really, you can't imitate that to the nth degree, I think, with a pair of headphones and some software.
The way I think about it is, if you grab onto a Bezier curve, so if you're an illustrator or you're doing a little motion curve or you're doing something else, you grab onto that arm, that moves your little curve up and down, move it really, really close to the dot, to the control point, and move it. And a little bit of movement makes a huge difference in the curve. Whereas if you pull that arm way out and then you move it a little bit, it has very fine tuning on your curve. And so as you move that out, you gain resolution. In the same way as you do surround mixes, the bigger the space, it's like moving that arm out, and you have much more high resolution of how things are affecting. You cannot mix a theater inside of headphones, or even a theater inside of a near field set of speakers. You need to be in a theater. So when they do mixes for film, they literally mix in a space the same size as a theater, because you don't have the resolution, that you would have otherwise. And so I think that in those environments, I think there's some places that you can mix, because if you decide everyone's watching on YouTube and listening in their headphones, well, you might as well mix in headphones. But if you think it's going to go to a larger space, you'll always have better resolution. It's kind of like shooting all your video in MP4 and then delivering it, whereas if you shoot it in RAW, you have all this extra data that you can kind of work with. Next question.
Moving on, the next one comes from frequent questioner Douglas Carmichael, and he says, in a Reddit discussion about the NBA bubble, it was mentioned that events in this class generally allow for significant prep and programming time. What's the best way to learn to program different consoles? Just dive into the offline editor?
Go ahead, Courtney.
I'm not sure what Douglas was talking about here as far as the NBA bubble is concerned. Perhaps that Reddit discussion was about the games that were played without an audience in the stands, where in some cases they actually mixed in audience reaction and cheers and things into the PA in the venue, so that the players would have reactions from the crowd that wasn't there. And that prep and programming time has to do with collecting the sounds from that specific venue, from other games, previous games, and stringing them together. And so learning to program them in different consoles, I don't know if that would be a problem. Usually those guys are working with the same console over and over. So I'm not sure what he's talking about there. But the prep and programming a lot of times would have to do with actually, pinging the venue and determining the best mix for the PA and so on in the venue.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback off what Courtney said, I think it's actually more important to learn one platform like Yamaha or whatever, and actually learn how engineers structure their mixes. How are you managing all these inputs? Are they going through subgroups? Are they going to DCAs? That operation is important. And what you could start to look at, if you can get your hands on them, and I'm happy to share what I have, are IO lists, inputs and outputs. And I do one for every show that has more than 10 inputs and outputs, So this is simply a spreadsheet that shows what are your inputs, what are they called? What channel are they on? What snake they're on? This is more the plumbing, for example, but that's a good start to learning really the operational side of this rather than a specific piece of hardware. And to this point, a good engineer who's never touched a digital console before, this particular brand of digital console, but they're very good at mixing on this other digital console, if they get just a little bit of time, they'll be fine.
Yeah. So a couple things. Number one is that for the most part, these are fixed systems. Whether it's the broadcast guys coming in with a truck, it's a fixed system, and it is why trucks tend to be very specific. So trucks tend to have the same kinds of mixers in the truck and the same kind of switchers. So, for instance, you see a lot of Sony switchers in a truck because it means you can hire anybody that can sit down and work it. In a major market. When you're dealing with the facility that's providing a mix out, that is a fixed setup, and it doesn't change ever. And they hit a programming button and it does the thing. That said, for an NBA game, you're probably looking at 50 to 60 people that are working all day on that event, like to prep it and to get it all put together. For an NFL game, like a Thursday night football, or a Sunday night football or Monday night football or whatever, you're probably talking about a handful of trucks, 4 to 8 trucks with 150 people that are working they load in, the night before or whatever, but just checking the cameras takes an hour, just to make sure that the cameras are working. Then that happens, 6 or 7 hours before the event. So those are the things that, those are all things. It's a huge buildup for one of these games. The people running those mixers generally started by running cables 10 years before. 10 or 15 years before, they were basically carrying cables, and they did that for a couple of years. Like just to be clear, like they, and then they got to maybe if they were really good at it, they got to manage the mics, and they got to do that for a couple of years, and then they might get to do one of the little mixers or one of the little whatever, or and so the folks that are actually mixing it have been doing this for a long time, and so that's the other thing is that they're sensitive to it. What we see in concerts is a lot of times a really good mixer will come in. They don't know a good audio mixer engineer will come in and not know anything about them. They have a mixer that they use. They don't know how it works. They have a mixing engineer that sets up everything the way that they want it to be. And and then they just come in and they complain about things. This isn't working. This isn't what I want. This isn't what I want. Somebody else figures all of it out for them. All they interface is the sliders. We worked with a big artist, and it was really funny to watch because they would just go like, this slider doesn't do what I want it to do, and then they just wait for someone to fix it, and they go back to smoking, but they do that all day until they get it just the way they want, because they're getting paid for their ears, not for their ability to engineer the mixer. And so that is so those are different ways of approaching these puzzles. Last question.
And our last one comes to us from Nick Batt in the UK, and he says, if we assume that hardly anyone can properly monitor Atmos and enjoy the full range of what it can deliver day to day, what's next?
Go ahead, Roscoe.
Well, I think headphones. I think, these are some really cool. The 3D is going to come to headphones. It's going to be relatively inexpensive for people to experience 3D through headphones.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, we can evolve into humans with multiple ears, just like spiders have multiple eyes. We can have 23 ears, and then we can properly listen to Atmos.
What's amazing is watching how far Atmos has come in the last year and a half. And I think that we're going to keep on seeing it move down that path. The main thing is that, for instance, the reason that I'm interested in Atmos or 5.1 and all those other bits and pieces is because I'm pretty clear that it's going to be a big part of our future. It is, and primarily because Apple and even YouTube are pushing down that pipe. And that's going to make it very hard to ignore. The money is so big that is now, that every mixing company I know is installing Atmos into everyone doing mixes for albums and so on and so forth is installing the ability to go to Atmos because of Apple. Because the artists are basically saying they're afraid they're not going to be viable. No one, everyone's afraid that, the biggest game in town, which is, Apple Music, it truly is. I mean, is because it has so much influence on that drive. It's not just that it's how many installed bass, but it's really all the entire ecosystem is very, very compelling for a lot of people. And so the thing is that there's so many people that are trying to release into Atmos right now that I think you're going to see a lot of people continuing to build a mix for it in the same way that you almost never see a film that isn't Atmos or 5.1. Like you don't see films made that way anymore. So I mean, you see those tags all the time. If you have an Apple TV or whatever, if you're looking at it, they're tagged as that, and they generally use those speakers, for it. It's kind of become the norm, and so I think you'll see that with music as well, and you'll see it with a lot of other things because it does. When you're used to it, I have to admit that, and I've had more time. I mean, it's a lot of my work is in Atmos or in 5.1 or something like that, and so my brain is kind of used to it now, and stereo and mono really sound like, I mean, to me, it's like black and white TV compared to color, like literally. I mean, that's how it feels for me. So I think that as the consumers buy more of those things, and a lot of this has to do with the sound bars have gotten really good. The up-firing speakers have gotten really good. A lot of these things don't require you to spend $10,000 anymore. You can spend, $2,500 or $700. Under $700 it gets a little rough, but in the kind of 500 and above, you can really get a good audio system for your home, and more people are, because less and less people are going out to movies, and that's going to most likely be a trend. That more and more content that we want to see is going to be at home, and as a result, people will want to keep on buying more of those things as they get pushed. That gets pushed down the path. So I think that it's important for us to be thinking about it. I don't think that a lot of it has to be complex. I think that a lot of it can be simple things. And again, people made fun of me when I did a 1080p podcast in 2005, I guess, because they were like, well, no one can actually download it. Like no one can actually watch that. It's too big. No one can, but I got a lot of work for that from that, because I was doing it as a podcast, I got really good at green screen, and I got really, really good at shooting that content, and I got really good at processing that weight of video. And then I was the only one at one point, I was really the only one in San Francisco that could do that level of work. And so I got a lot of work, from it. So we don't want to, as producers, we don't want to be too limited by the consumer. The consumer is always a couple of years behind us. The client is maybe a year or two behind us. And so, and if you just wait for them to ask for things, then usually someone else has already, had a lot of straws and milkshakes for a long time before you got there. So I can promise you that, people don't have to jump into spatial, but people like me will drink your milkshake pretty quickly if you don't. So by the time you get there, we'll already, be fat and happy. So that's the thing you have to be careful of, is not having people drink your milkshakes. So those are the things that you want to be kind of careful of when you say, well, we're waiting for the consumer to demand before we start creating it. And the reason, again, that we should, as developers, be constantly working on this, creating things, figuring it out, trading notes, is so that it's interesting and it sounds great regardless of whether it becomes, we'll know more about the audio pipelines, we'll know more about it, but it's coming. Spatial is coming fast, as is HDR. HDR was like this weird thing that no one thought about. Now you can't buy a TV without it, and so I think that, and the same thing with HD, it was people like, I don't know if I can really see the difference between HD, before, and now it is. So anyway, so I think that it would. And I'm really interested specifically to Nick, is I'm super interested in creating spatial environments with synthesizers. Like that's why I bought all this, relatively inexpensive synthesizers. I didn't want to go crazy, but I'm using them. I'm going to be playing with all their outputs as I reorganize all of this and be playing with what that looks like. I think you can create incredible experiences that with that you can't do any other way. Anyway, went a little over. Obviously, we're a little more relaxed at the end of the year. So, because I don't have a meeting right after this. So anyway, so I just want to thank all the producers for all the great questions. And playing. A lot of people showed up today, so I think we have some new folks. So welcome to the discussion. And thank you, of course, to the panelists who put up with all my craziness as well, and keep coming and keep providing just incredible feedback. It's an it really is all of us being smarter than any one of us. It's just such a great collection of answers today. So really well done. And anyway, so we have tomorrow. I would recommend tomorrow, if you're still listening, to get in early. So I don't know exactly. It may be slightly more people than we're used to. It could be a lot more people than we're used to. So I would get in early so that we can get kind of settled. And that is for everyone. My request is that panelists get in a little earlier than normal, as well as our producers, because tomorrow we have some pretty high profile people joining us, and I think we want to stay ahead of it. All right, we're going to jump into after hours.
Okay,